Welcome, human resource and OD professionals. Today we're going to talk about conflict and what you can do to resolve it. Conflict takes up a lot of emotional energy. It gets in the way of your team getting the job done, and it doesn't have to be that way. In today's video, we're going to talk about two simple tips to help your team move through conflict more effectively and get to real solutions. Let's get started. The reason that many teams address conflict poorly is because they keep putting it off. No one wants to get into it. So that is the first tip, and the first solution is to set the expectation on your team that issues and conflicts are addressed rapidly and openly. Rapidly meaning as soon as people start to feel like, hey, there's something going on here, we're not quite on the same page, that people then step into it very clearly and frankly. As they do so, they should distinguish between positions and interests. Positions are what people say they want to have happen. Interests are the reasons behind the positions that people take. According to Fisher and Ury, two of the real experts in this field, and I'll touch on that in just a moment, behind opposed positions lie shared and compatible interests. In 1978, representatives from Egypt and Israel were at Camp David, and they were trying to negotiate a peace settlement. In between the two of them, as you may remember if you were alive back then, the sticking issue was Sinai. Sinai had been part of Egypt since time immemorial, and during the Six-Day War, Israel had occupied the Sinai and still retained occupation of that territory. So it's now 11 years later, they're looking to settle a peace. And Egypt is saying, return Sinai. We need all of it back. Israel is saying, we're going to retain some of Sinai at very least. There's no way you're getting all of it back. Now, as you can see, these are their positions, and they're mutually incompatible. If we don't move the conversation to a different level, there's no way we can achieve the peace. The way they got past this was beginning to ask the crucial question of why. Why, Egypt, do you need us to return all of Sinai? Well, as mentioned earlier, Sinai had been part of Egypt since time immemorial, but Egypt had been overrun by conquerors from the Greeks to the Romans to the Turks to the French to the British, and had only recently regained their independence. There was no way a negotiator was going to come back to their people and have anyone be willing to accept the fact that part of their precious land was still occupied by a foreign conqueror. So they did need all of it back, but their interest was sovereignty and national pride. As they continued this discussion, again, Israel, what is Israel's interest? Why, Israel, do you say we must retain part of Sinai? Well, as you know a bit, perhaps, of modern history, Israel and Egypt and its other Arab neighbors had been through 3 wars since 1948, the Wars of Israeli Independence, 1948, the Six-Day War in 1967, and the Yom Kippur War in 1972. And Israel had almost been wiped off the map in the course of that. Israel's interest was security. We can't have your tanks that close to our borders. Now, when they changed the discussion from you must give it back to no, you will not have it back, to hey, we need sovereignty, we need to retain national pride, we need security. And then they began to think, are there ways that we can get both of those needs met? In fact, that's what they found. They were able to come to an agreement that was signed by Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat, in which all of Sinai was returned to Egypt fully in their control. Egypt only had to promise that certain sections of it were demilitarized. That is, it's yours, just don't put any tanks in it. They agreed to it, and it was the first peace agreement between Israel and any of her Arab neighbors. And now for an example a little closer to home. I was recently working with a heavy equipment manufacturer, international. This manufacturer serves the offshore drilling industry. And there was a conflict between their operations department and their quality assurance department. There's documentation that's supposed to be completed that is supposed to accompany the product as it makes its way out to the platform. And the paperwork wasn't getting done in a timely fashion, at least thought by some. And when operations and QA got together, operations' position was that, we'll get around to the paperwork when we get around to it. And more than likely, it's going to happen after the shipment because we got to get that product out there and we're busy, we're lean. QA was saying, no. You must give us the paperwork. That is the procedure. Follow the procedure. I've got to have the paperwork before the product ships. Now, once again, we have incompatible positions. We have one saying paperwork comes after, one saying paperwork comes before, and it can't go both ways. So they're either going to be equally dissatisfied or one's going to be dissatisfied most of the time. They began to ask the question again, why, with a little bit of prompting from me. And as you might imagine, drilling is a very time-sensitive information. If we're going to make the customer happy, we've got to get the product out there as quickly as possible. So operations, this was all about customer satisfaction. Now, QA, they weren't crazy folks either. They had legitimate interests, legitimate needs behind it. Some of their paperwork, this literally came down to legal compliance. That is, by law, they were required to have this paperwork done beforehand. Also, this was their opportunity to catch errors before they made their way out to the customer, was as part of this paperwork process. Once again, they shifted the conversation from this to how do we meet the needs to get the product to the customer quickly and make them satisfied while being compliant and catching errors. The solution they came up to was to commit to doing the paperwork beforehand. But QA could take some steps beforehand, both in preparing the documentation and being there right as the document shipped to assist the people in operations, that made the burden on the operations folks at the last minute, the documentation burden, much less, much easier to complete. They came together as a team, got both of their needs met, and it was just simply by beginning to talk about their interests and by listening to one another. Too often when conflict begins to simmer and we don't talk to one another, resistance builds up, angst builds up. If we do get together and talk about it, there's a blow up, or we just don't talk about it productively, and it really needn't be that way. Set the expectation on your team that, you know what, we're simply going to address it. And as you address it, start asking questions of one another. Tell me why you need what you say you need. And when both parties are asking about that, you'll find that most of the time people aren't crazy. There's real needs, real concerns, real legitimate issues that need to be addressed on both sides. And when two parties are working together to address both needs, we get to real resolution. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Let me recommend another resource to you. The book, Getting to Yes, Negotiating Agreement Without Giving In by Fisher and Ury is the classic in the field. If you are responsible for helping people work through conflict, this is a great frame and we'll have lots of tips and tools so that you can help move conflict situations forward. It is where I got the quote here, and also where I got the Egypt and Israel example that I referred to just a moment ago. Thanks again. Reach out to me if I can help you in any way, and look forward to seeing you next time.